So we are taking up again in Gideon. We are in chapter 7, and we are starting at verse 9. And if you remember, there was already a whittling down of the army of Gideon's army to 300 people, and there was some signs and miraculous things that have already happened that enabled Gideon to feel more confident in going forward. And before we move forward in the story, I just want to point out that this motif of fear is something that we see very, very much in the whole story of Gideon. So if we go back towards the beginning of the story in chapter 6, verse 36. Let's see, where are we? Yes, verse 36. Gideon said to God, if you really intend to deliver Israel through me, as you have said here, I place a fleece of wool. This whole story here, where he asks for the sign about the fleece and the dry and the wet, very much reflects the fact that he's afraid to go forward without some kind of a sign. And then in chapter 7, verse 7, we have now we've whittled it down to the 700. Then the Lord said to Gideon, I will deliver you and I'll put Midian into your hands through the 300 lepers. Let the rest of the troops go home. And this, of course, comes right after this idea of where Gideon has put forth, whoever's afraid, and cannot go forward from fear, then he can go home. And 2/3 of them leave. And then again in chapter 7, verse 10, we go forward and we say, that night the Lord said to him, come attack the camp, for I've delivered it into your hands. And if you are afraid to attack, first go down to the camp with your attendant Purah and listen to what they say. And we're going to, take a look at that story, but I just want to jump ahead. And if we look at chapter 8, verse 20, we have another situation, which we'll see that story later, where we have this young fellow who has the opportunity to kill 2 kings of Midian, and he doesn't do it because he's afraid. Okay, so we have very much, there's this whole war, this whole story of Gideon. We see a back and forth between a fear that seems to be present, a fear of the confrontation, a fear of the battle, a fear that is expressed by Gideon. It is then expressed by the majority of his army, which is why they leave, and he ends up down to 300 people. And then later on, we have the fear of a young boy to actually kill these kings of Midian, whom he should be killing right away. So we have that on the one hand. And on the other hand, as we mentioned last time, we don't see that there's criticism of Gideon. God seems to accept the fear, that this fear is normal, it's human, and he goes towards Gideon and trying to calm him down and give him signs and give him ability to go forward, to deal with his fear and to give him confidence that he will indeed win the battle, which of course is very different from some of the things that we saw in the past. For example, if we compare this to the story of Barak and Deborah, Barak is hesitant, very much like Gideon, and Deborah just thinks, well, aren't you being a sissy? Like this is actually ridiculous. So we have this balance going on throughout the story, and so just keep that in mind as we move forward. So if we're now going to chapter 7, verse 9, so again they're about to go to battle. And again, God starts this by saying to him not to worry, I'm with you. And he gives them an advice. So before, when he understands that Gideon is afraid, he does some kind of miraculous sign. Now we're going to see a whole different thing that God tells him to do. He says, verse 10, if you're afraid to attack, first go down to the camp with your attendant Purah and listen to what they say. After that, you have the courage to attack the camp. And that's, of course, exactly what he does. He sneaks up to the outskirts of the enemy camp, Okay, and it says here in verse 12, now Midian, Amalek, and all the Kedemites were spread over the plain as thick as locusts, and their camels were countless, as numerous as the sands on the seashore. So we have this description which just reinforces the fact that they have so much to fear. And keep in mind, they are 300 people, okay, standing up against this enormous army. And when they talk about thick as locusts, you can imagine, think about locusts. When locusts come, a plague of locusts, they come in such enormous numbers that they black out the light of the sun. So this imagery is of enormous numbers and 300 people coming up against them. But what happens? Okay, Gideon, this is verse 13. Gideon came there just as one man was narrating a dream to another. Listen, he was saying, I had this dream. There was a commotion. A loaf of barley bread was whirling through the Midianite camp. It came to a tent and struck it, and it fell. It turned upside down, and the tent collapsed. To this, the other responded, that can only mean the sword of the Israelite Gideon, son of Joash. God is delivering Midian and the entire camp into his hands. Okay, so here, God enables him to go and just hear a conversation between two ordinary people, lower, soldiers, not special people. And one recites his dream to the other. And in the dream, in the course of telling the dream and then interpreting the dream, it becomes very clear that they themselves, soldiers in the enemy camp, have no confidence whatsoever that they are going to defeat Gideon. They really believe that they have received the sign that God is going to deliver Midian into the hands of Gideon, that's it, Gideon is winning. And this reminds us very much of Rahab. When we read that story in chapter 2 in the book of Joshua, that when the spies come to check out on behalf of Joshua what is going on and what is Jericho and what are they going to be dealing with when they come up against Jericho, and basically they're not a very successful mission. They come in and immediately the king figures out that they're there. So they come, they're in the house of Rahab for a few minutes and they leave. But the time they spend in Rahab is critical for only one reason, because they hear that message from Rahab, who says, we heard what God has done for you in your victory over the Amorites and your victory and your amazing parting of the Red Sea and your departure from Egypt. And therefore, she says, we know, we're afraid of you and we know God is going to deliver Jericho into your hands. And so it's a very, very similar thing. And that in and itself is enough, in the same way that this gave confidence to Joshua to lead the nation to cross the Jordan and to attack Jericho. In the same way here, this gives Gideon the confidence he needs. Because, and here again, we have this balance of fear. And again, where the fear plays the role. We have the fear of Gideon and the Israelites on the one side, and yet on the other side, we have the fear of the nations of Midian. These two soldiers are expressing the fear, the lack of confidence. And at the end of the day, two fearful armies are coming up against each other, but the one who has God's help and the one who's able to have confidence in God's help, that is the one who will ultimately prevail. And that's really what we're seeing here. Okay, so then what happens? So he has 300 people, and now he's going to split the 300 even further, okay, into three different groups. Okay, so he has three different groups, each one has 100 people. Okay, and this is also a great story. He says he divided the 300 men into three columns and equipped every man with a ram's horn and an empty jar with a torch in each jar. Watch me, he said, and do the same. When I get to the outposts of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all those with me blow our horns, you too all around the camp will blow your horns and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. And so that's exactly what they do. They split up, they sound the horns, and they start banging their tins. Okay, now, when I read this story, every time I'm reminded of something that happened during Israel's War of Independence. And I believe that this story was actually the motivation or gave the idea for this story in the War of Independence. Now, during Israel's War of Independence, they were surrounded by armies. They were way outnumbered. I mean, it was clearly a Gideon situation. And I a couple of years ago read a book that brought this home to me. I can't remember the name of it, but if you send me an email, I'll look for it and I'll tell you. It's a story of the beginning of the Israeli Air Force. And today, when we think of the Israeli Air Force, just a couple of weeks ago, we saw how the Israeli Air Force, a plane was able to target a terrorist in a 6th-floor apartment building and kill the terrorist by sending a bomb right into a particular window, and nobody else in that entire building was hurt. I mean, this is insane, right? That's what we have today. But how did the Israeli Air Force begin? With 4 airplanes that could barely fly and a few pilots that were volunteers because they happened to have served as pilots in World War II. I mean, the stories are incredible. So, when you think about Israel's War of Independence, no Air Force, nothing, nobody is trained, no army. What are they going to do? And so they came up with this idea of a weapon, and they called it the Davidka. And what was this Davidka? They took a bunch of old hardware, nails and bolts and screws and all kinds of other stuff, and they put this thing together, and it became a makeshift mortar. This makeshift mortar really could barely hurt anybody, but it made the loudest noise you can imagine. And what happened is when they used this Davidka mortar, it basically made such a noise that it scared the Arabs, and they just ran away. And this is this story. And I'm sure that Ben Gurion, when he saw this story, said, aha, this is, we don't have numbers and we don't have arms, but let's just use this same technique. And of course, it worked then and it worked now as well. Okay, so that's exactly what they did. And they surround the camp and everybody runs away, which is really quite amazing. Okay. Now, we have in verse 23, and now the men of Israel from Naphtali and Asher and from all of Manasseh rallied for the pursuit of the Midianites. So they scared them away from the camp, and now they're going to go chase them down and make sure they get out of there. Okay, and so they're taking care of that stuff. Gideon, so these are people now beyond the 300, okay? The 300 succeeded, they did this, and that, of course, gave confidence for all these other people that were kind of standing on the sidelines to come and join the pursuit to drive the Midianites out of the area. Okay, in the meantime, Gideon sent messengers all through the hill country of Ephraim with this order. Now, let's just, I'm going to see if I can share this map again, because it's always good to... it's always good to be able to kind of see. So you see the map now? Okay.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Okay. So if you can see the map, we always use the same map. So you have a sense. This is the Sea of Galilee. Right here is the River Jordan. All of what Gideon is doing is coming around here in this area. You can see he himself is from Manasseh. Okay. And the tribes that he is most involved with here are Naphtali and Asher, 2 very big tribes in the north. We also see that Zebulun gets involved. He's right here in this border area between Manasseh and Asher and Naphtali. Issachar is not mentioned. I'm really not sure why. Maybe they just weren't very good at fighting. But this is the group. You'll notice, though, south of Manasseh is Ephraim. And now comes Ephraim, and they're saying, now, hold a second. It seems we see this earlier, when Gideon actually put out the call to come and fight against the Midianites, he only called to these few tribes in the north. He never called Ephraim. So in the meantime, all of a sudden now is the battle's already on its way, and they're getting involved. We see that, one second, there we go. We see that he now calls to Ephraim and gives him another job. He says, go now and seize the access to the water. Okay, so if you figure they're all in this area, the Midianites, and he's pushing them here, but he wants to close their access to the water. He wants to trap them. Okay, so all the men of Ephraim rallied and seized the water side down to Beth-barah by the Jordan. They pursued the Midianites and captured Midian's 2 generals, Orev and Ze'ev. They killed Orev at the rock of Orev, and they killed Zev at the winepress of Zev, and they brought the heads of Orev and Zev from the other side of the Jordan to Gideon. In other words, they pursued them east of the Jordan, didn't let them get away because they captured some of the passageways of the Jordan, basically created a bottleneck that forced them to cross over here, and killed these 2 princes or generals or whatever, and then crossed back onto this side. So this is Ephraim, they're crossing to here, and then they're coming back. Okay. In the meantime, when they come to Ephraim, the people from Ephraim come to Gideon, and they have a complaint. What did they say? They said, why did you do that to us, not calling us when you went to fight the Midianites? In other words, what happens here is that Gideon called them to join the fight after the original thing. And if you can think about it, they do a very brave thing here. They really They have a decisive hand in this fight against Midianites by trapping them and by killing these two main generals. And what I guess is going on here is, if you remember the original story where everybody gathers and he says, whoever's afraid, leave, it's very possible that Ephraim is basically saying here, we wouldn't have been one of the scaredy cats. We're big, brave guys. If you would have said whoever's afraid to leave, if you had called us Ephraim from the beginning, we would have been with you. You'd have many more than 300. Okay. But what happens with Gideon? And here we see actually characteristic of leadership here. Gideon is a wise man. He doesn't want to engage them. He doesn't want to fight with them. He doesn't want to say, justify himself. He instead just tries to make them feel good. So what does he say? He answered them, after all, what have I accomplished compared to you? Why, Ephraim's gleanings are better than Abiezer's vintage. Abiezer is his clan, the name of his clan within the tribe of Manasseh. He says, God has delivered the Midianite generals, Oreb and Zeb, into your hands, and what was I able to do compared to you? And when he spoke in this fashion, their anger against him abated. And we see throughout these stories of Gideon, we have here little vignettes that indicate to us not just how the story is moving, but it tells us something about Gideon. And what we see here very clearly is that Gideon is a very wise leader. This is a man who knows how to diffuse a potentially crisis situation. There's seams going on, and we've seen this in the past. We saw, for example, with Deborah, where she very much criticizes some of the tribes who don't go to for war. She sees some go and some don't. Here we have a situation where a tribe wasn't called and they wanted to go. So there's clearly these tensions between the various different tribes, rivalries and a lack of solidarity, and many times, which we'll see later on, and a lack of unity. And so he, instead of getting into a whole tit for tat kind of argument, he takes let's say the mature adult position, and he calms them down by giving them credit, by honoring them and showing them how important their contribution was. And I think that's really what this story is here for. Okay, now we're in verse 4, chapter 8, verse 4. Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed it. The 300 men with him were famished, but still in pursuit. He said to the people of Sukkot. Now it's possible that this happened before the Ephraimite thing, because we learned before that in verse 23, the previous chapter, verse 23, that now the men of Israel from Naphtali and Asher from all of Manasseh rallied for the pursuit of Gideon, of Midianites. Okay, and then comes the story about Ephraim. So it's very possible that this is just a continuation of the previous story, of the previous part of the battle, where Gideon and his 300 men are continuing to pursue the Midianites, and they cross the Jordan. He said to the people of Sukkot. Now, Sukkot is an Israelite community on the eastern side of the Jordan. And he said to the people of Sukkot, please give some loaves of bread to the men who are following me, for they are famished, and I am pursuing Zebach and Salmonah, the kings of Midian. But the officials of Sukkot replied, are Zebach and Salmonah already in your hands that we should give bread to your troops? Well, this is a disgusting response. On the one hand, we have Ephraim, it was insulted. They didn't get called to the battle, and they want to do everything they can to help. And then when he comes to Sukkot, to a group of people that didn't participate in all the battle, that didn't come to the aid of the rest of the nation of Israel in this battle against Midian. And not only didn't they come to the battle, but now when he goes and says, give us bread, we're hungry, we're tired, we're soldiers, we're fighting your battle. What do they say? What do you mean? You haven't showed me, that you've killed these kings, and it's just disgusting. So Gideon at that point says, I swear, declared Gideon, when the Lord delivers Zebach and Salmonah in my hands, I'll thresh your bodies upon desert thorns and briars. From there he went up to Penuel and made the same request of them, but the people of Penuel gave him the same reply as the people of Sukkot. So he also threatened the people of Penuel, when I come back safe, I'll tear down this tower. Okay, so he makes this pledge, and we have these two cities, and I've read somewhere, I can't remember where, that the understanding here is that they themselves created some kind of treaty with the Midianites. And as they succumbed to the Midianites, and they agreed to do what they wanted in exchange for being treated better. So they're traitors, these two cities. They are traitors. Not only they're not helping now, but they put their lot with the Midianites and did not join in solidarity with their people to fight this wicked oppressor of the nation of Israel. Okay, so now we're seeing that we already have the Ephraimites killed 2 generals, Orev and Ze'ev, and now Gideon is pursuing the head honchos, these 2 kings, Zebach and Salmunah. Now Zebach and Salmunah were at Karkor with their army of about 15,000. These were all that remained of the entire host of the Kedemites, for the slain numbered 120,000 fighting men. Amazing, okay? You have these 2 kings that are essentially running away. They're refugees because their army has been decimated, and yet Gideon understands that if he doesn't get the heads, these people are just going to rear their heads again and come back and bite. Gideon marched up the road of the tent rows up to east of Novach and Yogbaha and routed the camp, which was off guard. Zebach and Salmunah took to flight with Gideon in pursuit. He captured Zebach and Salmunah, the 2 kings of Midian, and threw the whole army into panic. Okay, and that's something we see very often in the Bible, and it's typical of ancient stories. There were no democracies in those days. The nation is the king, and the king is the nation. So if you have attacked and killed the king in a battle, your army is going to dissipate because they have no leader, and that is equivalent of defeat. You know, you capture the king, and actually, this is the basis of the game of chess. Okay, in the game of chess, you take the queen or the king, that's it, you won the game. It doesn't matter how many pawns that you've got in between. And there's a Bible story, something that in the book of Kings that you may recall that says this so much. There's that battle where Josaphat and Ahab are battling together against the Aramites, and Ahab is killed. And he asks, but he's not killed, he's shot, he's wounded. And he asks his aides to prop him up in his chariot so that he can continue the battle, because he knows that if as soon as the people understand that he's been killed or he's down, okay, they will all scatter. And that's it's the same idea. So here, once you have captured or killed the kings, everybody else scatters and you have won. Okay, on his way back from the battle at the ascent of Heres, of Chares, actually, Gideon, son of Joash, captured a boy from the people of Sukkot and interrogated him. Now remember, he did succeed in killing Zebach and Salmunah, and now he had made this promise. He says he's going to come back to these people, the people of Pnuel and the people of Sukkot, who refused to help him, refused to give them bread, and he's going to come back and he's fulfill what he threatened to do. So first, he finds a kid, okay, who's somebody from Sukkot, and he interrogates them to find out, well, who are the leaders? He doesn't want to hurt everybody. He wants to go after the leaders because these are the ones who were responsible. The latter, this kid, drew up for him a list of the officials and elders of Sukkot, 77 in number. Then he came to the people of Sukkot and said, here are Zebach and Salmunah, about whom you mocked me, saying, are Zebach and Salmunah already in your hands, that we should give your famished men bread? And he took the elders of the city, and bringing desert thorns and briars, he punished the people of Sukkot with them. As for Pnuel, he tore down its tower and killed the townspeople. So here we also see a tremendous leadership qualities. He knows how to rally his people, and when people do not obey him, he is going to threaten them, and when he succeeds, he's going to come back and honor his threat. So that is clearly a sign of powerful, strong leadership. And here we learn, in the next verse, we learn something we knew nothing about before. Then he asked Zebach and Salmunah, okay, those men you killed at Tabor, what were they like? They looked just like you, they replied, like sons of a king. They were my brothers, he declared, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had spared them, I would not kill you. And he commanded his oldest son, Jether, go kill them. But the boy did not draw his sword, for he was timid, being still a boy. This is what I referred to earlier, this additional example of fear playing a game, playing a role here. Then Zebach and Salmunah said, come, you slay us, for strength comes with manhood. They dare Gideon to slay him, and of course he did. So Gideon went over and killed Zebach and Salmunah, and he took the crescents that were on the necks of their camels. So here we have a clear situation where there's a difference now between this young kid who Gideon says kill him, an ordinary soldier, a young soldier, and he's afraid to do it, and Gideon, who has the ability, the strength, the courage, he is able to carry out his threats against the people of Sukkot and Penuel, and at the same time he is able to kill these 2 kings who clearly, have led the battle and are major threats to the nation of Israel, and he kills them. Okay, what did we learn now in beginning? We suddenly learned something about Gideon's family that we knew nothing about before, because he asks them about some incident that happened at Mount Tabor. Okay, and we don't know anything about this. This is the only place we learn about it. But there's some incident in Mount Tabor within the course of this war that the Midianites, or before the war or whatever, the Midianites, these two kings in particular, murdered Gideon's brothers. Now, it's very possible that we can see that this happened, okay, previously. If we want to say, well, where would this have happened? Okay, if we look at chapter 6, verse 35, okay? Chapter 6, verse 35. So if we look, let's start at verse 34, okay? The Spirit of the Lord enveloped Gideon. He sounded the horn, and the Abiezrites rallied behind him. So he has his whole family behind him, and he seems very confident and ready to go into battle. And he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, and they too rallied behind him. He then sent messengers through Asher, Zvulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet the Manassites. We see a man confident and ready for battle. And what's the next step? And Gideon said to God, if you really intend to deliver Israel through me, as you have said, here I place a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If dew falls only on the fleece and all the ground remains dry, I shall know that you delivered Israel through me, as you have said. How could it be that all of a sudden, when Gideon seems in verses 33 through 35, ready for battle, we don't have any indication that there's fear? All of a sudden, he asks for another sign. Where did that come from? It's very possible that the incident that he refers to here about killing his brothers at Mount Tabor happened in between verse 35 and verse 36. The whole family, it says it's his whole family. Abiezer is the main people behind him, and then all these other people from the other tribes are with him as well. It's very possible that it is at this point in time that suddenly these two kings attack and his brothers are killed. Okay? And so that you can understand that is going to set him back. Wait. I thought God was on our side. Wait. I thought we were ready for battle. What is this? My brothers are killed. And therefore, God comes towards him and says, yeah, you know, your brothers were killed, but you will still be victorious, and gives him the sign of with the dew and the fleece. And I think it makes so much clear if you see it in that context. Everything then becomes clear. It's not just, we said all along, we said that Gideon seems to be fearful. On the other hand, we don't see any criticism of Gideon. We don't see it as being lack of faith. If we put this story in there, it all makes sense. It's not lack of faith. He's encountered a tragic event that seems to contradict the promises he had from God that they will be defeated. And therefore, he does need an additional sign, an additional promise that in any case, it will be okay. Let's just finish the end of this story. I think we are finishing Gideon here. We're going to finish Gideon today. How's that? We got another minute or two. Let's do it. This is good, although we may continue the discussion next week. What happens as a result of all this? We see amazing qualities of leadership. He is faithful to God. He's successful in the war. He knows how to deal with potential crises in a peaceful way. He, on the other hand, takes decisive actions if he's going to kill these two kings, and they killed his brothers, so it makes it even more personal. All these qualifications that we see of him present a man who is a master leader. And as a result, that's exactly what the nation wants. And the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson as well, for you have saved us from the Midianites. What they are not asking here is not just become our tribal leader or become our judge or whatever. As soon as you say rule over us, you, your sons, and your grandsons, we are talking about creating a kingdom, creating a king, not just a ruler, a king, a monarchy where the leadership is passed from father to son. This is something we have not seen. We have had no mention of it until now. We will see it later on when the nation asks for Saul or asks for a king from Samuel, and it ends up becoming Saul. But this is the first instance that this happens. And it doesn't happen in the case of Saul. The nation says, we want to be like all the other nations. And we have a sense also that they are looking to a leader to save them. Here, the leader's already stepped up. He's proven his abilities. And then they say, well, we just want to crown you king because that's what you deserve. Okay. But he turns them down. He says, I will not rule over you myself, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord alone shall rule over you. And this, of course, is something that becomes quite a debate in how to read the whole idea of a king in Israel. Samuel hates the idea of a king. And you get a sense with Samuel that this is his opinion. What do you need a king for? Okay, you have a prophet, you have God, you don't need a king. Well, Gideon agrees. He says, I don't need to be your king, and you don't need a king because really we have God. And then he goes on. Gideon said to them, I request to make of you, each of you give me the earring he received as booty. They had golden earrings for their, you know what, I'm stopping here because this is taking us into a whole different story, even though they're all in the same section. But we're going to stop. Next time we're going to take up with verse 24 because that starts in a whole different story that requires serious discussion. So we will end here with this idea that Gideon refuses to become a king. And of course, that is going to be very ironic later on when we continue next week, not next, yeah, also we'll get to it next week, chapter 9, where we see what happens with Gideon's son, a whole different kettle of fish. Okay, so we're finished for today. Questions, anybody?
Looks like we have a question in the chat, Sondra.
Okay, let me take a look. Yes, the Vitka, the rail stop on Jaffa Road. There is a square there on Jaffa Road called the Vitka Square, and it is indeed named for that weapon. Yes.
I have a comment. The one thing that is noticeable in Shuftim is how little weapon the people of Israel had, because you had Yael with just a pin that she killed the general. And if you go on in Shuftim, you're going to see even Samson didn't have weapon. He used a jawbone of an ass, to kill many. And yet God was with them to give them the victory.
Well, I think that's very good. Although we do see that dream of the two soldiers, they talk about Gideon's sword. And I think we can assume that as Gideon is running to the, chasing them, they do have swords and they do have weapons, but they clearly don't have, powerful weapons, and they probably
like
don't have chariots.
Enemy. Yeah.
Yeah. They're outnumbered and out-weaponed by their enemies, no question. Yeah, and there's certainly a focus on God's assistance as opposed to might and big armor or something like that. Anyone else? Okay, so I hope you enjoyed our time together. It was great to see you again live, and I will look forward to seeing you again next week. Same day.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Good night, everybody.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you and have a wonderful day.